Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are opening the file on a scientist whose career, well, it wasn't really defined by a single flash of genius, but by something much rarer.
35 years of relentless, methodical patience.
Exactly. We're diving into the atomic architecture of life itself, and we're following the trajectory of Dorothy Hodgkin.
We're examining the sources surrounding the life and the profound work of Dorothy Hodgkin. She was born in 1910, and, she remains the only British woman scientist to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry.
Which she won in 1964.
That's right. And the material we've gathered really illustrates a career just dedicated to transforming this one technique, X-ray crystallography, from a sort of theoretical curiosity into the essential method for structural biology.
Okay, let's unpack that. Our mission here is to really get to grips with how a scientist who is often working through a debilitating illness and navigating, intense Cold War political tensions, how she managed to map the precise three-dimensional structures of penicillin, vitamin B12, and then the big one, insulin. She didn't just study molecules, she gave us the blueprints to life-saving medicine.
That phrase, blueprints to life-saving medicine, is exactly it. It's perfect. But before we can even begin to appreciate the scale of her molecular conquest, we have to establish the battlefield, so to speak.
The technique
It's not technique. Everything Hodgkin achieved relied on her mastery of X-ray crystallography, a technique so complex that it took her over 3 decades and, frankly, the invention of modern computers to fully realize its potential.
So let's nail this down first, because it really is the foundation of her entire legacy. We know the basics. You shoot X-rays at crystals, a pattern is created. But for an audience that gets the fundamentals of chemistry, what was the technical hurdle that made applying this to, complex biological stuff so revolutionary?
Well, the initial hurdle wasn't really about collecting the X-ray data. That part was, difficult but understood.
It was the interpretation.
It was all about interpretation. When X-rays hit the regularly arranged atoms inside a crystal, they scatter or diffract. And this diffraction pattern, it looks like a series of spots on a piece of photographic film. Now, the intensity of those spots, how bright they are and their location, that contains all the information about where every single atom is.
So the pattern is the key. But how on earth do you go from a flat two-dimensional pattern of dots to a three-dimensional model of a hugely complex molecule like a protein?
That's the million-dollar question, and it requires the most challenging step in crystallography, which is solving what's known as the phase problem.
The phase problem.
Right. When light, or in this case X-rays, is scattered, you can measure the intensity of the scattered waves. You can see how bright the spot is.
Okay.
But you lose the information about the phase of that wave. And the phase is essentially, it's the timing or the starting point of that wave relative to all the others.
So without the phase, you have all the ingredients, but you have absolutely no recipe for how to assemble the molecule.
Exactly. You said it perfectly. Mathematically, to reconstruct the electron cloud of the molecule, you have to sum up a whole series of waves. It's a process called a Fourier transform.
Right.
But if you don't know the phase of those waves, the resulting map is it's garbage. It's meaningless. And Hodgkin's genius, her real contribution, lay in finding clever ways to determine or at least estimate those phases for bigger and bigger molecules.
And the result of that is these three-dimensional contour maps of electron density.
Yes, which allow you to pinpoint exactly where the atoms are sitting. This is why her work was so essential. She didn't invent crystallography, but you could say she invented the methods that made it work for biology.
That sets the stage perfectly. She was dealing with a structural problem, a mathematical problem, and a computational problem all at once.
And a personal one, as we'll see.
Let's move into part 1 then. The architect of atoms. Her early life and influences, because it really seems like her formative years instilled the exact kind of detailed pattern recognition she would need later on.
Absolutely. Dorothy Mary Crowfoot was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1910. Her parents, John Winter Crowfoot and Grace Mary Hood, everyone called her Molly, they were deeply involved in colonial administration and later archaeology.
So they were based in North Africa and the Middle East.
Yes, which meant her childhood was, to say the least, unusual.
Nomadic, really. The sources say she spent a lot of her early years separated from her parents, staying with her grandparents near Worthing in England. That sounds quite isolating.
It could have been, but the sources suggest a very strong intellectual influence, especially from her mother, Molly.
Okay, tell me about Molly.
Molly was a very proficient, dedicated botanist, and she really fostered Dorothy's innate curiosity. She didn't just, encourage an interest in science. She provided the critical early tools.
Right.
At age 10, Dorothy was already fascinated by crystals. She was growing them. And then, for her 16th birthday, Molly gave her a copy of W. H. Bragg's seminal work concerning the nature of things.
And Bragg, of course, was one of the absolute pioneers of X-ray diffraction. So that gift wasn't just a book, it was a roadmap.
It was a signpost. It solidified her career path almost instantly. She wrote about it years later, about the clarity of that moment. But before she fully committed to chemistry and X-ray analysis, there was this fascinating detour.
Into archaeology.
Yes, which, if you look at it structurally, it looks exactly like her later scientific work. It's incredible.
Tell us about that. This feels like a real key to understanding her mind.
Well, in 1928, at the age of 18, Hodgkin went to join her parents at an archaeological site. It was Jerash, in what is now Jordan. The site was filled with ancient Roman and Byzantine ruins.
And what was her job there?
Her job was incredibly rigorous. She was tasked with documenting the Byzantine-era mosaics from these 5th and 6th century churches, and these things are just incredibly intricate.
So she was essentially performing a kind of pre-chemical structural analysis.
Precisely. She spent over a year creating these precise, measured scale drawings of incredibly complex and often fragmented floor patterns.
Piece by piece.
Piece by piece, tessera by tessera. It requires an intense, almost obsessive focus on pattern, on detail, on symmetry, and on reconstruction from partial data.
She was decoding the blueprint of ancient stones.
Yes, which required the exact same mental muscle she would later use to decode electron density maps. She even did chemical analyses on the little glass tesserae to understand their composition.
The sources say she enjoyed it so much, she actually considered switching to archaeology for good. That's a profound thought, isn't it? The greatest structural chemist of her generation almost became an archaeologist.
It's an amazing sliding doors moment, but thankfully for science, she stuck with chemistry, though she still had to overcome these early institutional barriers.
Right, the entry requirements for university.
She did. Her school, the Sir John Lehman Grammar School, it didn't teach Latin. And back then, Latin was a non-negotiable requirement for getting into Oxford or Cambridge.
So what did she do?
Her headmaster had to personally give her private Latin tuition so she could pass the entrance exam. It just highlights how arbitrary and, frankly, gendered the hurdles were for aspiring female scientists at that time.
But she cleared them. She got into Somerville College at Oxford in 1928 and graduated in 1932 with a first-class honors degree in chemistry.
And she was one of only 3 women at the institution to achieve that distinction at the time, a huge achievement. But the real scientific revolution for her started when she left Oxford.
When she went to Cambridge.
That's right. She immediately went to Cambridge to start her PhD at Newnham College under a man named John Desmond Bernal. He was often known simply as the Sage.
And Bernal wasn't just her supervisor, was he?
No. He was a catalyst for her entire worldview, scientifically, politically, and personally. They were lovers for a time before her marriage.
So how deep was his influence, and why was he so pivotal for her research?
Bernal was a visionary. He was one of the few people who believed that X-ray crystallography could be applied not just to simple salts or minerals, but to the massive, complicated machinery of life itself, proteins.
Which was a very controversial idea at the time. Most people thought proteins were just biological sludge, essentially.
A lot of chemists did, yes. They thought they were too irregular, too amorphous to ever form crystals suitable for X-ray diffraction.
Bernal thought differently.
He did. And Hodgkin worked with him on the technique's very first application to a crystalline protein, pepsin. Pepsin's a digestive enzyme. Bernal took the initial, very rough X-ray photographs.
And what did those first pictures show?
They showed spots, clear, defined diffraction spots. This was a moment of utter revelation.
It proved they weren't just goo.
It proved definitively that protein molecules were orderly, three-dimensional structures with repeating internal patterns. They weren't amorphous at all. Hodgkin is credited with extending this foundational work, and that moment, the pepsin experiment, that was a birth certificate of structural biology as a discipline.
It's incredible. She was there at the very beginning of the field she would later come to dominate. And yet, she eventually returned to Oxford, which became her scientific home for the rest of her life.
She did. In 1933, she was awarded a research fellowship by Somerville College. She went back the next year, set up a small lab, started teaching chemistry, and by 1936, she was appointed the college's first fellow and tutor in chemistry, a position she held for over 40 years.
That stability must have been crucial.
It was. That stability at Oxford allowed her to focus on the long, decade-spanning projects that would come to define her entire career.
And before we leave this crucial period, we have to acknowledge this really unlikely academic connection she forged in the 1940s, a relationship that crosses the great political chasm of modern Britain.
It's one of the great historical footnotes, isn't it? Margaret Roberts.
Who would later become Margaret Thatcher.
That's the one. She was Hodgkin's undergraduate student from 1943 to 1947, and Hodgkin had a profound effect on Thatcher's scientific training.
The ultimate Tory Prime Minister learning chemistry from a committed, lifelong socialist. What does that tell us about their professional dynamic?
I think it speaks volumes about mutual respect in the pursuit of knowledge. Hodgkin was a lifelong Labour Party supporter. Her husband was even in the Communist Party for a while. And Thatcher, well, she became the figurehead of modern conservatism.
That complete political opposition.
And yet, Thatcher held Hodgkin in such high regard that years later, she commissioned a portrait of her and hung it prominently in her Downing Street office.
Wow.
They may have disagreed fundamentally on how society should be governed, but they absolutely agreed on the fundamental rigor of science. It's a powerful testament to the idea that scientific truth can sometimes transcend political ideology.
That sets the stage perfectly for the paradoxes in her later life, which we'll get to when we cover her peace activism. But first, let's jump into the actual core breakthroughs. Part 2, the core discoveries, charting the path from steroids to the Nobel Prize.
Her journey really began with her PhD research on sterols, which are a class of steroids. After she earned her PhD in 1937, she just kept going with this work. And by 1945, working very closely with CH, Harry Carlisle, she achieved her first major structural success.
Which was the structure of cholesterol iodide.
That's it.
So why was that particular structure so important?
Because it was the first ever three-dimensional biomolecular structure of a steroid determined using X-ray crystallography. Steroids are these complex, bulky molecules, hormones like testosterone, cholesterol.
Right.
And successfully mapping the full 3D geometry of one of them demonstrated to the entire scientific community that X-ray crystallography was a viable tool for complex organic compounds. It proved the method had graduated from simple salts to, biologically relevant molecules.
And the very next molecule she tackled was immediately relevant to the global conflict that was underway at the time, penicillin.
The urgency couldn't have been higher. This was during World War II. The life-saving potential of penicillin was obvious, but to manufacture it, to modify it, you had to know its exact structure.
It became a critical, highly secretive wartime project.
It did in 1945. And Hodgkin and her team, which notably included a brilliant scientist named Barbara Lowe, they were the ones who solved the structure.
Now, this is where this specific chemical detail really matters. Why was the structure so hotly debated, and what did Hodgkin's crystallography reveal that finally settled the argument?
Well, the scientific community, especially the synthetic organic chemists, they were completely split. The two main proposed structures for penicillin had fundamentally different cores.
Okay.
One involved a simple thiazolidine ring structure, but the other one, which was supported by Hodgkin's data, contained this four-membered, highly reactive structure called a ball-lactam ring.
And why was that so controversial?
Because the ball-lactam ring is chemically unstable. It's strained, it's reactive, which is precisely why penicillin works.
I see.
That reactivity is what lets it attack bacterial cell walls and interrupt their synthesis. Hodgkin's structural map confirmed the presence of this unstable ring, and in doing so, it proved the structural model championed by Robert Robinson, who had actually been an initial skeptic.
So she provided the definitive proof, the structural key, that told synthetic chemists exactly what they needed to recreate and, eventually, modify to produce newer generations of antibiotics.
That's it. Without knowing that precise spatial arrangement, large-scale synthesis would have been impossible, or at the very least far, far less efficient.
And the work was completed in 45.
It was, but because of the wartime secrecy and just the massive amount of data, the full publication didn't appear until 1949. And notably, it was published under her maiden name, D. Crowfoot.
It's incredible to think that the core chemical secret of the world's first widely successful antibiotic was delivered by her team. And if penicillin was groundbreaking, the next target, vitamin B12, was her Everest.
It truly was her structural Everest. This is the work that earned her the Nobel Prize, and it was a technical leap that Lawrence Bragg famously compared to breaking the sound barrier. She started on B12, or cobalamin, in 1948.
So why was vitamin B12 so uniquely difficult? What made it a sound barrier moment?
B12 was, by a huge margin, the largest, most structurally complex vitamin known at the time.
How big are we talking?
We're talking a tangled knot of 181 atoms, a massive biological structure compared to penicillin, and most critically, previous attempts to solve the phase problem for molecules of this size had just completely failed. The computational power simply did not exist to process the hundreds of thousands of individual X-ray reflections.
So the sheer size and the complexity were the immediate barriers. How did she bypass the phase problem for this monster of a molecule?
This is where her genius for methodological innovation really shone through. She had a flash of insight. She realized the molecule contained a single heavy metal atom,
Cobalt.
the cobalt clue. Precisely. Compared to all the light atoms that make up the rest of the molecule, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, the cobalt atom, with its high electron count, it scatters X-rays much, much more strongly.
And she used that to her advantage.
She used it to employ what's now called the heavy atom method.
Can you elaborate on that method?
Sure. A heavy atom acts like a fixed reference point, a massive beacon inside the crystal. Because the scattering contribution of that single heavy atom is so dominant, you can calculate its position relatively easily.
I see.
And once you know the exact phase contribution of that one atom, you can use some complex mathematics to estimate the phases of all the rest of the scattered X-ray waves. It effectively solves the phase problem for the entire structure.
That's a profound shift in thinking using a chemical feature of the molecule to solve a purely mathematical problem. It turns a limitation into a huge opportunity.
It was absolutely revolutionary. It proved that even massive biological structures could be forced to yield their secrets. Now, the work took years of painstaking measurement and calculation, often relying on these early punch card computing systems.
A dawn of compute.
It was. But the final resolved structure, published in 1955 and 1956, was just unprecedented. And it was this detailed, three-dimensional blueprint of B12 that led directly to her Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1964.
This ability to map structures provides the blueprint not just for understanding function, but for chemical synthesis. It fundamentally changed how we approach complex pharmaceuticals. Which brings us perfectly to the next and longest chapter of her life. The quest for insulin.
Ah, the 35-year quest for insulin. This is the defining narrative of her entire career's tenacity. She received her first sample of crystalline insulin from Robert Robinson way, way back in 1934.
1934.
Yes, and the fascination for her was immediate because of the hormone's profound and complex effect on human metabolism and its direct link to diabetes.
25 years. That's a career within a career. I mean, if she had solved B12 by 1956, why did insulin remain unconquerable for another decade and a half?
It was pure complexity and computational limitation. Insulin is a small protein. It's made up of 51 amino acids, and they form this complex structure with two linked chains.
So it's much bigger than B12.
B12 had 181 atoms. Insulin has many hundreds more, especially when you factor in all the solvent molecules in the crystal. This complexity just created an impossibly dense electron cloud.
The math required to perform that Fourier transform on insulin must have been astronomical.
It was beyond manual calculation. I mean, in the 1930s, crystallographers used these things called Beaver's Lipson strips. They were small, pre-calculated Fourier coefficients to help perform the sums.
A kind of manual calculator.
Exactly. But even for a molecule of insulin size, you would need to perform millions of these sums by hand. It just wasn't feasible. They had the method, but they had to wait for the technology to mature.
So the true breakthrough in 1969 wasn't some sudden chemical insight, but rather the necessary symbiosis between fundamental science and technological advancement, the arrival of high-speed digital computing.
Absolutely. The mid to late 1960s saw that necessary leap in computing power and also refinement of the X-ray techniques themselves. This finally allowed Hodgkin and her large international team to tackle the mountain of calculations required to solve the phase problem and generate the accurate electron density maps.
And in 1969, they did it.
By 1969, they published the 3D structure of the insulin hexamer. The quest was over.
And the impact of finally having that blueprint must have been enormous for diabetes research.
It was instrumental on two major fronts. First, just understanding the structure allowed pharmaceutical companies to refine their methods for the mass production of naturally derived insulin. But second, and far more critical in the long run, the structure provided the precise location of every single atom. Scientists could then rationally alter the molecule structure. They could mutate amino acids or change the crystallization solvent to create improved drug options.
Like longer-acting or faster-acting insulins.
Exactly. For both type 1 and type 2 diabetes patients. She continued to work on this, advising laboratories all over the world, cementing her commitment to the real-world application of structural science.
For science was never siloed, was it? And that brings us naturally to the profound and sometimes challenging political dimensions of her life.
Indeed. We've already established her lifelong commitment to the Labour Party, which contrasted so sharply with her famous former student, Margaret Thatcher. But the political environment she operated in, particularly during the Cold War, placed her in frequent conflict with Western governments.
And her husband, Thomas Hodgkin, he was an eminent historian. He was part of this narrative as well.
Thomas was an intermittent member of the Communist Party. He spent significant time abroad, particularly in West Africa, advising figures like Ghana's President Kwame Nkrumah.
And that association, combined with Dorothy's own deeply held beliefs about peace and social equality, drew the suspicion of U.S. authorities.
It did.
And this suspicion had very real, punitive consequences for her scientific life.
Oh, absolutely. Due to her political activities and her husband's associations, the U.S. government banned her from entering the country in 1953.
1953.
Imagine that. A scientist on the absolute cusp of the B12 breakthrough, barred from attending essential international conferences. For subsequent visits, she was only granted entry through a special CIA waiver.
That puts into sharp relief the challenges faced by scientists trying to maintain international collaboration during the height of the Cold War. She was, in effect, a scientific bridge builder operating under continuous surveillance.
That's the perfect description. Hodgkin deliberately and actively maintained her scientific contacts across the Iron Curtain. She had deep connections with crystallographers at the Institute of Crystallography in Moscow. She visited India regularly, and she established a really powerful relationship with the Chinese group who were also working on insulin.
How often did she go to China?
She visited China 7 times between 1959 and 1993.
That takes some serious commitment, especially given the geopolitical climate of the time.
Her commitment to global science was unwavering. There's a particularly powerful anecdote from 1971. The Chinese group, who had been working in complete isolation, they had independently solved the structure of insulin.
Wow.
And for a moment, they'd achieved a resolution even higher than Hodgkin's own team. And Hodgkin, she recognized the brilliance of their achievement and worked tirelessly to try and integrate them into the global scientific community.
But the political barriers were just too high, even for a Nobel laureate.
She served as president of the International Union of Crystallography from 1972 to 75, but she was unable to persuade the political authorities in China to allow their scientists to become members of the union or to attend its international meetings.
So the data was shared, but the human connection was restricted.
It was. It really shows the limits of science as a diplomatic tool when it's faced with hard state policy.
In her motivation for all this, it was clearly fueled by the social conscience she inherited from her mother.
That social conscience drove her profound concern about social inequalities and increasingly the devastating threat of nuclear war. This led her into what was really a major second career in peace activism.
As president of the Pugwash Conferences.
She served as president of the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs from 1976 all the way to 1988.
And the Pugwash Conferences were crucial for bringing scientists from East and West together to discuss arms control. Her leadership there must have been incredibly valuable, given her established connections in Moscow and Beijing.
Her integrity gave her credibility across all ideological lines. Her dedication to peace and disarmament was recognized in 1987 when she accepted the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet government.
That's a significant honor.
It was, and it came just a year before the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which dramatically reduced the risk of nuclear confrontation in Europe.
We should also briefly touch upon one highly unusual political entanglement that sort of underscores the risk of operating in these politically charged environments. The anecdote involving the Romanian dictator's wife.
It's a layer of nuance that highlights the fraught reality of international scientific diplomacy. In her early 70s, Hodgkin agreed to write a foreword for an English edition of a scientific book.
What was the book?
It was titled Stereospecific Polymerization of Isoprene, and the book was published as the work of Elena Ceausescu, the wife of Romania's communist dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. Hodgkin wrote positively about the author's outstanding achievements.
But the reality was far less savory.
Much less. After the overthrow of the Ceausescu regime in 1989, it was completely exposed that Elena Ceausescu's scientific credentials were entirely fraudulent. The work was ghostwritten for her by others.
So Hodgkin was used.
It was an incident that illustrated how political figures sometimes exploit the credibility of true scientists like Hodgkin for legitimacy. She was ultimately a brilliant, but perhaps, politically naive diplomat who just believed in universal human contact.
It shows that even the most grounded scientists can get caught up in the machinations of global politics. Now let's pivot sharply to part 4. Resilience and recognition, because all these monumental achievements, the decades of calculation, the global travel, the political maneuvering, they were all accomplished while she battled a crippling physical adversary.
This is perhaps the most humbling part of her story, her battle with rheumatoid arthritis. She was diagnosed at just 24 years old in 1934. The condition caused immense pain, progressive swelling, and eventually distortion in her hands and feet.
For a scientist whose entire life was defined by the precise manipulation of delicate crystals, fine instruments, and careful positioning of X-ray cameras, that diagnosis must have been just devastating.
It was an immediate physical obstacle to her work. The sources recount this particularly powerful, almost poignant image of her in the lab.
What was that?
Due to the increasing stiffness and deformity of her hands, she struggled to operate the main electrical switch on the X-ray equipment, a simple action that you'd need to do countless times a day.
And what did she do?
She didn't stop. Instead of abandoning the work, she improvised. She constructed a specific lever mechanism that allowed her to operate the switch using her shoulder or her forearm, compensating for the lack of fine motor control in her hands.
Wow.
That image, the future Nobel laureate having to engineer a tool just to operate the tool that would unlock the structures of life, it's a symbol of her fierce determination.
Her condition continued to worsen over time, didn't it? Leading to severe deformities and the necessity of using a wheelchair in her later years. And yet, her scientific output never ceased.
Her persistence was absolute. She remained scientifically active, traveling the globe, mentoring students, right up until her death in 1994. Her personal story of resilience is just inextricably linked to her scientific accomplishment.
That incredible persistence was naturally matched by the magnitude of the honors she received. They truly reflected her global and historical impact.
The Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1964 for her work on vitamin B12 was, of course, the highest possible scientific honor, but the recognition went far beyond the academic community.
In 1965, she was appointed to the Order of Merit,
which is a very rare personal distinction granted by the reigning British monarch for exceptional service. She was only the second woman ever to receive it.
and she broke another significant gender barrier at the Royal Society later on.
She did. In 1976, she became the first woman ever to receive the prestigious Copley Medal from the Royal Society, a highly respected award established way back in 1731.
That's a big deal.
It recognized her overall achievement in structural biology and placed her in the company of historical giants like Darwin and Einstein.
She accumulated a long list of other major honors as well, didn't she?
Absolutely. The Royal Medal in 1956, the Lomonosov Gold Medal from the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1982, the Dalton Medal in 1981. The list goes on. Institutionally, she also served as Chancellor of the University of Bristol from 1970 to 1988.
And circling back to the Royal Society.
Right. In 1982, she was the first woman fellow of the Society to have her portrait included in their permanent collection.
Let's talk about her nomenclature for a second, because her various names, Crowfoot, Hodgkin, Hodgkin, they reflect the historical changes in how professional women were recognized at the time.
It's a fascinating historical marker. Initially, she published exclusively as Dorothy Crowfoot. It wasn't until 1949, 12 years after her marriage, that she was persuaded to include her married name for her contribution to a book chapter on penicillin.
And today?
Today, different institutions use slightly different names. The Royal Society's celebrated fellowship is just named the Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship, while others, like the National Archives, use her full maiden and married names. Dorothy Mary Crowfoot Hodgkin. It shows the complex transition in professional identity for women marrying during that era.
But her most enduring legacy is perhaps not in the names on awards or publications, but in the institutional support she inspired for future scientists who are facing similar hurdles.
That is the most profound part of her influence, I think. The Royal Society's Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship is designed specifically to support outstanding early career scientists who require a flexible working pattern due to personal circumstances.
So things like parenting or caring responsibilities.
Or, most poignantly, health-related reasons. It recognizes that brilliant science doesn't happen in a vacuum of perfect health or, domestic support. It institutionalizes the recognition of the exact barriers she had to navigate throughout her entire life.
It ensures that her legacy is not just about the molecules she mapped, but about the conditions under which structural science can thrive for everyone.
And finally, Britain has commemorated her twice on stamps, placing her alongside true scientific titans.
In 1996, as one of 5 women of achievement, and then again in 2010.
Yes, and the 2010 set was particularly significant. It was celebrating the Royal Society's 350th anniversary, and she was the only woman featured in a set of 10 stamps honoring the Society's most illustrious members.
Placing her permanently alongside figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Ernest Rutherford.
A remarkable testament to a truly impactful life.
So, what does this all mean? Our deep dive into Dorothy Hodgkin reveals a scientist whose genius, I think, really lay in her structural patience and her methodological innovation. She took X-ray crystallography, and by overcoming the mathematical and the computational limitations.
From the heavy atom method on B12 to waiting decades for computers to be able to solve insulin.
Right. She provided the essential blueprints for these life-saving molecules. And she did all of this while navigating a crippling illness and the treacherous ideological lines of the Cold War.
Her 35-year pursuit of insulin is the ultimate lesson, isn't it? She began with a question in 1934 that was, for all intents and purposes, technically unsolvable. The solution was unlocked in 1969, not by a sudden change in chemical understanding, but by the relentless refinement of technique coupled with the arrival of necessary computational power.
It was a victory of enduring vision and, really, faith in technology.
It was.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Hodgkin showed us that the greatest breakthroughs sometimes require not just genius, but the humility to wait decades for technology to catch up to the theoretical ambition. So, which major biomedical breakthrough today, perhaps understanding the precise, ultra-high-resolution structure of a misfolding protein implicated in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or modeling the exact dynamics of large viral complexes, which one is currently stalled by technical limits, just waiting for a modern 35-year quest of patience and computational dedication to unlock its secret? Something to consider as you digest this knowledge.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.